Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anthony Smith, and this presentation will be on Japanese camps, the United States' injustice to Japanese Americans. This presentation is for the Liberal Arts Class 495 Capstone Advanced Research Project. The instructor, Dr. Aaron Morris. It will be due May 30th, 2023. In order to talk about the internment camps in the United States, we need to briefly talk about the events that led up to the internment of Japanese Americans. This slide is entitled Spy Games Round 1, as it's been confirmed that the United States began spying on Japanese Americans as early as 1930s, using the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, and the Office of Naval Intelligence to gather information on Japanese American citizens in order for us to be prepared for a day that we may need to use that information. This need to spy on American citizens comes from the United States seeing the alignment of countries like Nazi Germany and Italy under their dictator Mussolini, and the alignment of Japan's emperor and his country to their causes. With the United States having a large population of Japanese Americans, specifically on the West Coast, it began to spy on its own citizens. Their intelligence led to the detainment and removal of over 3,000 individuals, some community leaders, some religious leaders, and everyday citizens. The removal of these individuals came weeks before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. They were forcibly removed from their homes, their businesses, and transported to detainment centers while their assets were frozen. They were unable to communicate in many cases with their families. Imagine your loved one goes off to work and doesn't come home. It's 1940s. There is no way of tracking their location. You can call the business, you can go down there, but there's no way of knowing exactly where they are. Some of the Japanese Americans went weeks or months before they were allowed to communicate to their families. This slide is entitled Spy Games Round 1, because this would not be the first time that the United States would spy on its own citizens. A few weeks later, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese military launched an attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, where the United States has military bases and housed a significant number of its naval fleet. After consultation with his military advisors, the next day, December 8, 1941, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR as he would later become known as, delivered an address to a rare but joint session of Congress, seeking a declaration of war. He would receive a unanimous approval. A few months later, February 1942, FDR would sign, at the behest of his military generals, specifically Lieutenant General DeWitt, and with opposition to the executive order from attorney generals, President Roosevelt would sign Executive Order 9066, which authorized the military to use force to remove and detain anyone it saw fit for protection of the country, which was all the military needed to remove Japanese American citizens without specifically calling out Japanese American citizens. Order 66 may sound familiar to those that are Star Wars fans. George Lucas, a student of the humanities, film, art, literature, creator of Star Wars, may have found his inspiration for Emperor Palpatine's infamous phrase, "Execute Order 66," where the clone troopers turned their backs on the Jedi who were there to support them, much like the United States turned its back on Japanese Americans who were thriving in the United States, owning businesses, contributing to taxes, fueling the economy. Life in the camps. After the signing of Order 9066, Japanese Americans, approximately 125,000 of them, were removed from their homes, their businesses, their schools, and were transported to one of the 10 camps in the United States. The conditions in the camp were military style. Barracks with little to no insulation to offer protection against California or Arizona's heat, or the humidity of Arkansas, or the bitter cold of Wyoming and Montana. They were crammed in tight spaces, bunks on top of one another, personal belongings on top of one another, no privacy. Like their Jewish counterparts across the sea, they were trained into these camps by thousands, forced into tight and uncomfortable conditions with the fear of the unknown of what am I going to get myself into. Despite their treatment and this new, uncomfortable, unfamiliar environment, the Japanese tried to make the most of their new situation, showing their resiliency, showing their humanity, their ability to cling on to hope. Japanese Americans had schools to educate their children in the camps. They had jobs within the camps. Manufacturing facilities where one camp would manufacture mattresses for all camps. Another camp would manufacture clothing for the prisoners in camps, etc. The Japanese Americans also had their own police departments, their own fire departments, and entertainment as they put on theatrical shows within the camps. Shortly after their internment, newspaper articles and radio would begin to spew racist and hateful rhetoric against the Japanese Americans. They were referred to as Japs, which is a recognized derogatory phrase, as you can see in the picture on the left, where somebody painted "No Japs Wanted." These are American citizens in their country, segregated and imprisoned. But this wouldn't be the first time the United States did this. One well-known reporter used, ironically, his protected freedom of speech and freedom of the press to call for the revocation of Japanese constitutional rights for the Japanese American citizens to habeas corpus, which is the right to face your accuser. Instead, that well-known news reporter would go on to say that detainment of Japanese Americans, all Japanese Americans, would be for the betterment of the country. The United States would see roughly 1,500 Japanese Americans die in their relocation camps. Relocation camps was the name given to make internment camp sound more politically correct. While 1,500 is a small number compared to their Jewish counterparts across the sea who died in the millions in their camps. One thing can be agreed on: these deaths were avoidable. These deaths were fueled by panic, fear, hatred, racism. These deaths will be a permanent stain on America's history. After the full and unconditional surrender from the Emperor of Japan, the United States would begin to close internment camps, but not before the Supreme Court got involved and ruled that Japanese citizens who are not located in internment camps, not detained, should have the same rights of travel and free movement as all other citizens. And in March of 1946, the last camp in California closed. It would be almost 40 years later that President Ronald Reagan would issue a formal apology to the Japanese American people for the actions taken by the country they were born into. Congress would approve reparations in the amount of $20,000 to approximately 80,000 people under the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. It would later come out that over 125,000 Japanese Americans were wrongfully detained, and that the intelligence used to justify their detainment was wrong, fabricated, or nothing more than speculation. Fast forward an additional 20 years, or 60 years post Pearl Harbor, the next greatest terrorist attack on American soil becomes today's day that will live in infamy. An attack orchestrated by Al-Qaeda and their leader Osama bin Laden sparks what would become the longest conflict in American history, the War on Terror. Muslim Americans would see a similar propaganda of racist rhetoric, stereotype, and hate for being associated with the ones responsible for the attack, despite no affiliation or direct ties to the organization other than religion. Immigrants from Pakistan and Afghanistan, or American citizens with ancestors or families in those countries, or American citizens thought to be sympathizers to the Al-Qaeda movement, would become targets of American surveillance through the Patriot Act. And thanks to individuals such as Edward Snowden, we would later come to find out that the United States government openly spies on all its citizens and collects data on everyone. Thank you.